In the streets of Hanoi in 1945, the air was thick with both hope and uncertainty. Crowds gathered in the squares, cheering for independence, while hidden in the alleys, revolutionary leaders were quietly preparing their next move. Across the countryside, villages stirred with whispers of rebellion and long-suppressed ambitions. The end of the Second World War had brought freedom from one oppressor, but a new struggle was already beginning, one that would engulf the nation for nearly 8 years and change Vietnam forever. In the years following the end of the Second World War, many parts of the world were undergoing dramatic political change. Empires that had once controlled vast overseas territories were beginning to weaken, and across Asia and Africa movements for independence were growing stronger. One of the most significant of these struggles took place in a region of Southeast Asia known as Indochina. The conflict that would become known as the First Indochina War began in 1946 and lasted for nearly 8 years. At its center was a struggle between French colonial authorities and Vietnamese nationalists who were determined to create an independent nation. Although the war was initially a colonial conflict, it gradually became connected to the wider tensions of the Cold War, drawing international attention and support from powerful nations. To understand how the war began, it is important to look at the long history of French rule in Indochina. During the 19th century, France expanded its colonial empire across Southeast Asia. Over time, French forces gained control of several territories in the region, including Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. These areas were eventually organized together as French Indochina. Under colonial administration, France introduced new systems of government, education, and economic organization. Railways, roads, and ports were developed, and trade expanded. However, these changes were largely designed to benefit the colonial system rather than the local population. Many Vietnamese farmers and workers experienced heavy taxation and economic inequality, while political power remained firmly in the hands of French officials. As the 20th century progressed, resistance to colonial rule slowly grew stronger. Vietnamese intellectuals, students, and political activists began discussing ideas about national independence and self-determination. Some groups promoted peaceful reform, while others believed that independence could only be achieved through revolutionary struggle. Among the most influential figures in the Vietnamese independence movement was a man named Ho Chi Minh. Born in 1890, Ho Chi Minh spent many years traveling and living in different countries, including France, the Soviet Union, and China. During these years, he became deeply involved in revolutionary politics and developed strong beliefs in both Vietnamese independence and communist ideology. In 1930, Ho Chi Minh helped establish a political organization known as the Indochinese Communist Party. The party aimed to organize workers and farmers in the struggle against French colonial rule. Although French authorities attempted to suppress these movements, the ideas of independence continued spreading throughout Vietnamese society. The situation changed dramatically during the Second World War. In 1940, as France struggled against German forces in Europe, Japanese troops moved into Indochina. Although French colonial officials remained in place for a time, real power increasingly shifted to the Japanese military. For the people of Vietnam, this period was marked by hardship and instability. Food shortages and economic disruption became widespread. In 1945, a devastating famine struck northern Vietnam, causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. As the war in the Pacific approached its end, Japanese control in the region weakened. In August 1945, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Across Asia, the collapse of Japanese authority created a sudden power vacuum. Vietnamese nationalist groups quickly moved to take advantage of this moment. The most important of these groups was the Viet Minh, a revolutionary organization led by Ho Chi Minh. The Viet Minh had been fighting both Japanese forces and French colonial authority during the war, while also organizing local support among the population. In the days following Japan's surrender, the Viet Minh launched what became known as the August Revolution. Their forces seized control of major cities and government buildings across northern Vietnam. Within a short time, the organization had established authority over much of the region. On September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before a large crowd in Hanoi and declared the independence of Vietnam. The new state was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. For many Vietnamese citizens, this moment represented the long-awaited beginning of national independence. However, the situation soon became far more complicated. France, which had lost control of Indochina during the war, was determined to restore its colonial authority. French leaders believed that rebuilding their overseas empire was essential for national prestige and economic recovery after the devastation of the Second World War. At the same time, international politics were becoming increasingly tense. The alliance that had defeated Germany and Japan was beginning to dissolve, and a new rivalry was forming between the United States and the Soviet Union. This global struggle, later known as the Cold War, would soon influence events in Southeast Asia. In the months after the declaration of Vietnamese independence, negotiations began between French representatives and leaders of the Viet Minh. At first, both sides attempted to find a political solution that might avoid a large war. Discussions focused on the possibility of Vietnam becoming a self-governing state within a French union. However, these negotiations were filled with suspicion and disagreement. Vietnamese leaders believed they had already declared independence and expected full recognition of their new state. French authorities, on the other hand, wanted to maintain strong control over the region. Tensions slowly increased throughout 1946. Small clashes began occurring between Vietnamese fighters and French troops in several cities. The fragile peace that had existed after the war was beginning to collapse. By the end of that year, the situation had reached a breaking point. In December 1946, heavy fighting broke out in the city of Hanoi between French forces and Viet Minh fighters. The violence quickly spread to other parts of the country. This marked the beginning of the First Indochina War, a long and difficult conflict that would reshape the history of Vietnam and eventually influence the course of global Cold War politics. By the end of 1946, the fragile attempts to negotiate a political settlement between the French authorities and the Vietnamese independence movement had completely collapsed. The fighting that began in Hanoi quickly spread across northern Vietnam, marking the beginning of a long and difficult war that neither side had fully expected to last for many years. At the beginning of the conflict, French forces held several important advantages. France still possessed a modern army with trained officers, artillery, aircraft, and naval support. French troops controlled major cities, ports, and transportation routes across much of Indochina. These advantages allowed them to maintain strong defensive positions and protect important colonial infrastructure. However, the Viet Minh had their own strengths that would prove extremely important as the war developed. The movement had deep support among many Vietnamese peasants, especially in rural areas. The organization was also highly disciplined and motivated by the powerful idea of national independence. Instead of attempting to defeat the French army in large conventional battles, Viet Minh leaders adopted a strategy based largely on guerrilla warfare. This approach involved small mobile units that could move quickly through forests, villages, and mountainous terrain. These fighters often avoided direct confrontations with larger French forces and instead focused on ambushes, sabotage, and surprise attacks. The geography of Vietnam played a major role in shaping the conflict. Much of the countryside consisted of thick jungles, rugged mountains, and remote villages connected by narrow roads or footpaths. For local fighters who understood the terrain, these landscapes offered many opportunities to hide, move supplies, and organize resistance. French commanders soon discovered that controlling major cities did not necessarily mean controlling the countryside. Even when French troops secured towns or military bases, Viet Minh fighters often remained active in nearby rural regions. At night, guerrilla units would sometimes enter villages to organize support, gather supplies, or recruit new fighters. During these early years of the war, the Viet Minh also worked carefully to build political support among the population. Local committees were organized in many villages, helping coordinate food supplies, intelligence gathering, and communication between different regions. In this way, the war was fought not only with weapons, but also through political organization. For many ordinary Vietnamese farmers, the conflict gradually became part of daily life. Some villages supported the Viet Minh openly, while others were caught between both sides and tried simply to survive the difficult conditions of war. Fields still had to be planted and harvested, even as soldiers moved through the countryside. French forces attempted several strategies to weaken the Viet Minh movement. One approach involved establishing fortified posts in key rural areas in order to control roads and transportation routes. Another strategy focused on large military operations designed to locate and destroy Viet Minh bases. However, these efforts often faced difficulties. Viet Minh fighters could quickly disappear into forests or mountains when large French units approached. Supply lines stretched across difficult terrain, and maintaining control over wide rural regions required enormous resources. During these years, an important military leader emerged within the Viet Minh movement. His name was Vong Nguyen Giap. Giap had once been a history teacher, but he became one of the most influential commanders of the Vietnamese revolutionary forces. Under his leadership, the Viet Minh developed a flexible strategy that combined guerrilla warfare with the gradual building of a more organized army. Giap believed that the war would be long and that patience would be essential. Instead of seeking immediate victory, the Viet Minh focused on slowly weakening French control while strengthening their own forces. Small units gained experience through local battles, while larger formations were gradually organized and trained. As the war continued into the late 1940s, the international situation also began to change in ways that affected the conflict. The Cold War between communist and non-communist nations was becoming increasingly intense. Events in neighboring China soon had a major impact on the war in Indochina. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended with the victory of communist forces led by Mao Zedong. The establishment of the People's Republic of China created a powerful new communist government just north of Vietnam's border. This development was extremely important for the Viet Minh. For the first time, they had a neighboring country that was sympathetic to their cause and willing to provide assistance. Supplies, training, and weapons could now move across the border into northern Vietnam. At the same time, Western governments began viewing the conflict in Indochina through the lens of the Cold War. The United States, which had initially been cautious about involvement in the region, became increasingly concerned about the spread of communism in Asia. As a result, American support for French military efforts gradually increased. By the beginning of the 1950s, the First Indochina War had evolved into more than a simple colonial conflict. It had become part of a much larger global struggle between competing political systems and alliances. On the ground in Vietnam, however, the war continued to unfold slowly and painfully across villages, forests, and mountain valleys. Both sides were preparing for larger confrontations that would soon transform the conflict from scattered guerrilla fighting into major battles between organized armies. The stage was now being set for a new phase of the war, one that would eventually lead to some of the most important and decisive battles in the history of modern Southeast Asia. By the early 1950s, the First Indochina War had moved beyond scattered skirmishes and small-scale guerrilla attacks. The Viet Minh had grown into a highly disciplined and organized force, capable of taking on larger French units in coordinated operations. Their strategy combined knowledge of the terrain with patience, political organization, and increasingly sophisticated military tactics. French forces, meanwhile, struggled to maintain control. Although they still held major cities, key ports, and important transportation routes, the countryside remained a constant challenge. Every village, valley, and mountain range seemed to hide Viet Minh units ready to launch ambushes or sabotage operations. French commanders began to realize that conventional military strength alone might not be enough to win the war. In 1953, one of the most significant French operations took place at the fortress of Dien Bien Phu in northwestern Vietnam. The French believed that establishing a heavily fortified base in this remote valley would allow them to cut off Viet Minh supply lines and force the enemy into a conventional battle where French firepower could dominate. They poured troops, artillery, and supplies into the valley, confident that the combination of fortified positions and air support would secure victory. However, the Viet Minh had studied the area carefully and understood how to use the terrain to their advantage. Under the leadership of General Vo Nguyen Giap, they moved thousands of soldiers, artillery pieces, and supplies through difficult mountain paths, often under the cover of night. Ingeniously, they positioned heavy artillery on hills surrounding the valley, giving them the ability to bombard French positions from unexpected angles. When the siege began in March 1954, the Viet Minh attack quickly revealed the limitations of French planning. Despite superior technology, French forces found themselves encircled, under constant fire, and cut off from reinforcements. For weeks, the battle raged with incredible intensity, as both sides endured harsh weather, rough terrain, and mountain casualties. The siege of Dien Bien Phu became a symbol of the broader conflict. It demonstrated the determination, organization, and resilience of the Viet Minh, while exposing the challenges that colonial powers faced in attempting to control a nationalist insurgency. By May 1954, after more than 50 days of fighting, the French garrison surrendered. The defeat shocked France and the wider world, signaling that the colonial era in Southeast Asia was coming to an end. The outcome at Dien Bien Phu had far-reaching consequences beyond the battlefield. International attention turned to negotiations and the question of Vietnam's future. In Geneva, Switzerland, diplomats from multiple countries convened to discuss peace and the political division of Indochina. These talks sought to end the conflict while addressing the demands of both the French and the Viet Minh. The Geneva Conference resulted in an agreement that temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The North came under the control of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, while the South remained under a separate administration, initially under French influence. Elections were planned for the future, but political disagreements would prevent them from ever taking place as intended. Although the First Indochina War officially ended with this settlement in 1954, the region remained tense. The legacy of the war shaped both Vietnam and the wider international community. It marked the end of French colonial dominance in Indochina and set the stage for future conflicts, as global powers continued to become involved in the political and military struggles of Southeast Asia. On the ground, Vietnam bore the scars of nearly 8 years of war. Cities, villages, and fields had been damaged or destroyed. Families had been displaced, communities disrupted, and a generation of soldiers had endured the hardships of prolonged combat. Yet for many Vietnamese, the victory of the Viet Minh represented the beginning of self-determination and the hope of building a nation free from colonial rule. The First Indochina War serves as a historical example of how a determined and organized nationalist movement, supported by local populations and guided by strategic leadership, could challenge even the most powerful colonial armies. It also illustrates how global politics, emerging ideologies, and regional conflicts became intertwined in the early years of the Cold War. After the decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, the First Indochina War drew to a close, but its consequences continued to shape the region for decades. The surrender of French forces marked the end of more than 70 years of colonial rule in Vietnam, and it created a new political reality in Southeast Asia. Yet the end of open warfare did not mean the end of tension, division, or uncertainty for the Vietnamese people. The Geneva Accords, signed in July 1954, formalized a temporary division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The North came under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, while the South remained under a separate administration, backed by France and later the United States. Although the agreement called for nationwide elections to reunify the country, these elections were never held, setting the stage for decades of political conflict and the eventual outbreak of the Vietnam War. For ordinary Vietnamese, the years of the First Indochina War had been devastating. Cities and villages had been destroyed, farmlands laid waste, and infrastructure left in ruins. Millions had been displaced, living in temporary shelters, forests, or along riverbanks while attempting to rebuild their lives amid the lingering uncertainty. Families were often separated by the new political boundaries, and communities struggled to recover from the human and economic toll of nearly 8 years of continuous fighting. In the north, the Viet Minh began consolidating power. They organized local administrations, collected taxes, and sought to establish control over both urban and rural areas. Education, healthcare, and local governance were gradually restored, all while preparing the population for the difficult task of nation building. In the south, French influence persisted for a time, but the political situation remained unstable, with local leaders trying to assert authority amid rising nationalist sentiment. Internationally, the First Indochina War had important implications. The conflict demonstrated that a determined nationalist movement could defeat a colonial power, inspiring other independence movements across Asia and Africa. At the same time, the war was increasingly viewed through the lens of the Cold War, with the United States becoming more involved in supporting anti-communist governments, and China and the Soviet Union extending aid to communist movements. The experiences of the war also shaped military strategy and tactics in the region. Guerrilla warfare, supply line disruption, and the use of difficult terrain became defining features of conflicts that would follow. Leaders on all sides learned lessons about the limits of conventional military power when facing a highly motivated and strategically agile opponent. By 1955, Vietnam remained divided, but the period of open fighting had ended. The North and South each began pursuing very different political, economic, and social paths. The North focused on land reform, centralization, and building the foundations of a socialist state, while the South leaned on Western assistance to maintain stability and promote development under a different political system. Although the First Indochina War ended, the memory of the conflict remained vivid for everyone who had lived through it. Veterans and civilians alike carried the scars of the long struggle, and stories of courage, hardship, and survival became part of the collective history of the nation. Generations would remember both the human cost of war and the determination of the Vietnamese people to seek independence and self-determination. The legacy of the war also reached beyond Vietnam. It altered global perceptions of colonialism, influenced international policy in Asia, and became one of the early examples of Cold War-era conflicts where local struggles intersected with global ideological tensions. It set the stage for the next chapter in Vietnamese history, the events that would unfold in the Vietnam War, and the continuing struggle over the future of the peninsula. In the quiet countryside, in the hills and forests that had been battlefields, life slowly began to return. Farmers replanted fields, children returned to schools, and villages worked to rebuild homes and communities. Yet beneath the calm surface, the memory of conflict remained, a reminder of both the cost of war and the enduring human desire for freedom, identity, and nationhood. The First Indochina War, lasting nearly 8 years, was more than a colonial struggle or a military campaign. It was a profound test of resilience, strategy, and national determination. It reshaped Vietnam, changed global politics, and left a lasting imprint on history. And for the people who lived through it, its impact would be remembered, felt, and studied for generations to come.